Hi guys, this is Dr. TS, and today I'm going to start our series of lectures in Module 6, which is focused on cells. So what is a cell? Cells are considered the smallest functional unit of life, meaning that all living organisms, so all organisms that meet those 8 properties of life, are composed of at least one cell. So everything we've talked about so far, subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, and macromolecules, right? These are not considered living things. All of these are going to feed into and build into a cell, but they are not considered alive. Cells are the smallest functional unit of life. And so in order to understand human biology, we need to understand how cells work. Additionally, all cells arise from existing cells. So for example, if you have something like a skin cell here, it can split itself into 2 distinct cells. So all cells came from an existing cell. Now there are 2 major groups that we put cells into, and there's going to be some distinguishing features about these 2 groups that are important for you to understand. These 2 groups are called prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells, if we look at its name, prokaryote, this means before the nut. And you might be like, well, what is the nut in this case? It means nucleus. So prokaryotic cells, evolutionarily, do not have a nucleus. There is no nucleus inside of them, whereas eukaryotic cells are after nut. So eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. And we can actually generalize this presence or absence of a nucleus to the idea that prokaryotic cells do not have any membrane-bound organelles. So prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles, and that includes the nucleus. So whether or not a cell has these membrane-bound organelles or not defines if a cell is prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So that is the presence or absence of the nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So let's kind of take a look at a table. First, let's define organelle. So organelles, and we're going to have a whole lecture on this, are these little structures within a cell that have a specific function. So for example, the nucleus is really important for DNA storage. So these membrane-bound organelles, kind of like the organs in your body, are all going to serve specific functions to the cell. And you'll learn more about what those organelles are and what they do. So let's further break down some of the important differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. As we already said, right, prokaryotic cells do not contain membrane-bound organelles, and eukaryotic cells do. Another big defining difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that prokaryotes tend to be really, really small, like teeny, teeny, tiny. The classic example of a prokaryote are bacterial cells. These are microscopic organisms. You need a microscope to see them, whereas eukaryotes tend to be bigger, right? You can have single-celled microscopic eukaryotic cells, but you can have eukaryotes that are very, very visible. For example, we are eukaryotic organisms. Our animals, plants, all of these things are big multicellular organisms. DNA in prokaryotes is stored in the cytoplasm, which is just kind of the general area within the cell, whereas in eukaryotes it's stored in the nucleus. Prokaryotic cells typically exist just as single-celled, so just one is usually enough to make an organism, right? So most bacterial cells that we think about, a singular cell is considered a single organism. There are some examples of multicellular prokaryotes, but most prokaryotic cells are single-celled organisms. There are some single-celled eukaryotic cells, but most eukaryotes we think of are multicellular. So as I said, humans are a multicellular eukaryotic organism. The types of organisms that we consider prokaryotes are bacteria and a group called archaea. Eukaryotes encompass a much wider range, so animals, including humans, plants, fungi, and there's a group called the protists. The protists tend to be the single-celled eukaryotic organisms. So these are some of the more important fundamental differences. Prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. They do not have a nucleus. They are very small. They are typically single-celled organisms, whereas eukaryotes tend to be much bigger. They do have membrane-bound organelles and a nucleus. They can be single-celled or multicellular, and they encompass a lot of the everyday things that we encounter. Now, one of the really cool things is that in evolutionary history, right, our best understanding of it right now as a field of biology is that prokaryotes predate eukaryotes. So the first organisms on this planet were most likely prokaryotic single-celled organisms. And the prevailing theory is that eukaryotes came from prokaryotes. So kind of in the evolutionary history of the world, prokaryotes were first, and then eukaryotes came second. And there's kind of two ideas on how this happened. So how do we think that eukaryotes came from prokaryotic cells? And again, these are theories, these are ideas that scientists are kind of constantly checking, looking at both evolutionary history and using things like the scientific method to figure out. The first theory is of endosymbiosis. So symbiosis, symbiotic, simply means that there is a relationship between two organisms that is mutually beneficial. So one example I like to give of a symbiotic relationship is that of a whale and fish that live next to the whale. So for example, whales very, very commonly become covered in barnacles, which imagine it as like really itchy parts on their body that they can't reach. So oftentimes they will be in a symbiotic relationship with a smaller fish that will come and eat the barnacle or remove the barnacle from the whale. And the fish is in itself receiving both a food source and also protection, because the whale is a huge organism that can protect that smaller fish from kind of other predators. That's symbiosis, their mutually beneficial relationship with each other. So the same idea can also be applied to the production of eukaryotic cells. So the idea is there was an ancient prokaryotic cell that was pretty big, the big 4 prokaryote, and there was a smaller prokaryotic cell, and somehow that prokaryotic cell ended up inside of the bigger prokaryotic cell. And so now that smaller prokaryotic cell is protected from predators, is protected from other things that could potentially take it out. And now they're kind of mutually benefiting each other. Now this bigger cell can get more energy or have a place to store things. And so this is one idea of how we developed those membrane-bound organelles, how we have almost as smaller organelles within the bigger cell overall. Another theory is something called invagination. So all of our cells are surrounded by a membrane, right, that's made up of phospholipids. And the idea of invagination is that that membrane actually got brought into the cell and started to create these membrane-bound regions that eventually became, specialized organelles that then serve a purpose to the cell overall. So again, these are two theories on how eukaryotic cells came from prokaryotes, and they're kind of ideas on how we saw the evolution of a eukaryote from a prokaryote. But it's really important to understand the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, because we as humans are eukaryotic cells, and that's mostly what this class is going to be focused on, but we do care about prokaryotes, right? There are bacteria that are prokaryotes. All bacteria are prokaryotes, and bacteria are things that we worry about because they can cause illness. And so understanding the fundamental difference between these two types of cells is really important in biology. And while this class is going to be mostly focused on eukaryotic cells because it is a human biology class, if you go on and take classes like microbiology, you will learn more about prokaryotes and how they work. Awesome, guys. Thank you.